The dark rules that make you psychologically untouchable were never meant to make you kind. They were designed to make you unbreakable. This statement might seem overly dramatic until observing who excels in high-pressure situations where errors carry consequences. Whether in boardrooms, during political campaigns, or in difficult negotiations, a recurring pattern emerges. Individuals who maintain emotional composure often set the tone for everyone else. Often, we hear a different narrative that emphasizes confidence, authenticity, and rapport building. Current leadership theories value vulnerability. Yet, a review of historical outcomes shows a different picture. Niccolò Machiavelli, in his 1513 work The Prince, never advised rulers to be emotionally expressive. Instead, he emphasized appearances, calculation, and self-control. He noted that a prince must know how not to be good when circumstance demands, not because cruelty is admirable, but because maintaining power necessitates emotional insulation. Machiavelli didn't invent these hard truths. He simply documented them. A simpler example can be found in laboratory settings. In 1963, Stanley Milgram conducted his obedience experiments at Yale University. Participants believed they were administering electric shocks to others. The disturbing finding was that authority, not viciousness, drove their actions. The experimenters' calm demeanor dictated the room's atmosphere. When the authority figure expressed doubt, compliance decreased. Thus, emotional stability, even when morally questionable, fostered control. This is often described as psychological invincibility. To elaborate, a person who doesn't absorb the worry of others becomes the point of reference, influencing the emotional states of those around them. I've seen it happen in corporations. A CEO announces layoffs without any change in mood. Employees watch his face for any hint of what he's feeling inside, such as conflict, anger, or fear. If they don't see it, two things happen. First, resentment increases. Second, compliance becomes the norm. The emotional vacuum forces people to find resolution themselves. In contrast to such behavior is the reactive personality. Think of a manager who answers every accusation, a politician who impulsively responds to critique on Twitter, or a partner who overreacts at the smallest perceived rejection. Their open display of emotions feels honest, but also gives others an advantage. Each reaction becomes valuable information. Traditional psychology often presents emotional intelligence as empathy and sensitivity. Daniel Goleman brought the idea into the mainstream in the 1990s, arguing that the ability to know and handle feelings is key to good leadership. The subtle flaw in this understanding is confusing managing emotion with expressing emotions. The most long-lasting leaders are those who control their emotions rather than express them openly. There's a distinction. I used to think that being authentic would cause better stability. Negotiation studies at Harvard during the 80s and 90s by scholars like Roger Fisher talked about principled negotiation and being open about what you want. This works if both parties are willing to work together. The more one side shows how invested they are in the result, the more pressure they feel. This is known as asymmetry of reactivity. Watch two people who are being publicly attacked. One gives a press conference in a steady voice, carefully choosing their words, not talking about anything other than what is important. The other answers in real time, protecting themselves, correcting every point. The first one seems calm. The second seems involved. Studies on how authority and general impressions affect people's opinion, starting with Edward Thorndike's study in 1920, show that people think those who appear calm are also more capable. Calm is thought to mean skill. However, there's a fine line. Being emotionally untouchable isn't about not having emotions, but about cleverly hiding any emotional dependence. Machiavelli said that a leader should seem nice, faithful, kind, honest, religious, but must be willing to act differently when he needs to. This is often seen as proof of his negative beliefs. I see it as advice on how to protect yourself emotionally. Give the appearance of being available, but don't truly be available. This difference can mean survival. Think about political advisors during big elections. Inside stories often show that when a candidate gets upset after seeing bad poll numbers, the team falls apart. If the candidate doesn't react in public, even they're mad inside, the team starts to work together again. The leader's emotional control is like a container. This can make others feel uneasy. Coworkers describe such people as hard to read, cold, and hard to reach. Romantic partners call them distant, and reporters call them disciplined. Being around someone like that is difficult to understand. You can't find their emotional buttons. However, people look for ways to influence others. In 1974, psychologist Ellen Langer showed how feeling in control can change behavior. If people think they can impact outcomes, they become more engaged. If that idea is taken away, they change how they act. A person who is emotionally untouchable limits clear ways to influence them. Since you can't predict what will impact them, you don't want to push them. This is where you can't just be confident. Confidence is only on the surface. Being untouchable goes deeper. It means not letting your emotions be used by others. I didn't expect to see how this goes against current beliefs about being open. The workplace talks about rewarding being open, but gives raises those who can handle stress without showing it. People say they like vulnerability, but follow those who are composed. This is not often talked about. So, is being emotionally untouchable a strength, or simply being distant? The truth may be complicated. Strength means having inner resilience. Being distant means having a plan. Reality, the two become mixed. Over time, being strategically non-reactive changes who you are. A tactic becomes a mindset. There's a tension. If people in power are those who are least emotionally accessible, what happens to places that are built on trust and being open? Does power always go to those who don't show their emotions? The hard rules don't start with being cruel. They start with being protected. Once being protected works, the question isn't about avoiding being manipulated. It is about how far someone will go, so no one ever finds their weak spot. If being protected keeps emotions safe, then seeing things clearly keeps your position safe. Before controlling outcomes, budgets, decisions, or people, you control the narrative of what's happening. Once the narrative becomes stable, reality starts to change around it. This is where the advice about just being real begins to fail. I used to believe that being real was an advantage. Then I looked at what makes a good first impression. In 1920, psychologist Edward Thorndike talked about the halo effect. When one good trait, like being attractive or confident, changes how you see other traits like intelligence or morals. Later studies confirmed this idea. In hiring studies, identical resumes with different photos gave different ratings of skill. Only the picture changed. Performance was thought of, not measured. This is a fundamental bias. When a CEO comes on stage wearing a simple black shirt, like Steve Jobs did during Apple events in the 2000s, the outfit becomes part of the message. Simplicity, control, vision. The product launch is like a show with lighting, pace, and language carefully planned. The product is called revolutionary before anyone touches it. Reviews will agree. the story has already stuck. People aren't judging the product, but confirming their feelings about the brand. Apple knew something Machiavelli would have understood. People judge with their eyes more than with their hands. Everyone sees what you seem to be. Very few know what you truly are. The same ideas are used in darker experiments. In 1963, Stanley Milgram's test showed that people were willing to give painful electric shocks to strangers. The person in charge wore a lab coat, spoke calmly, and said they were from Yale. These things created a sense of authority. The shock level became less important. People were following authority, not the horror of what they were doing. When the setting changed from Yale to a basic office building, fewer people followed orders. Reality didn't change, the narrative did. This shows that the brain relies on assumptions. We don't start from nothing, we start from assumptions. Company public relation departments work on this idea with precision. In 1982, when Tylenol capsules with cyanide killed users, Johnson and AMP, Johnson immediately called the event sabotage rather than negligence. They took millions of bottles off the shelves and worked with the authorities. Their story showed that they were in charge and also victims. Sales dropped at first, but later recovered. Compared to the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill, BP didn't talk about how serious the disaster was. Images of officers playing down the damage were shown alongside images of rigs on fire and animals covered in oil. The narrative failed. Public anger grew. The technical facts of both events were terrible. The difference was how they managed public perception in the first 72 hours. For employees in these organizations, perception isn't abstract. It affects how they feel. When leaders communicate clearly, even bad news feels kept under control. The team falls apart when the message changes all the time and rumors start to spread. I've seen organizations collapse, not because of a restructure, but because their internal narrative shifted daily. Uncertainty grows due to inconsistent messages. People can't tell what's the truth. Political branding shows us even clearer proof. In the 1960s, the debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon showed how important image is. Radio listeners thought the debate was even. TV viewers preferred Kennedy by a lot. He looked calm, tan, and in control. Nixon looked pale, uneasy, and was sweating on camera. Their policies didn't change. The viewer's perception did. The camera changed who won the election. In recent elections, advisors spend a lot of money on researching policies and creating targeted narratives. Social media lets them test out different forms of messaging in real time. The phrase is changed, an image is swapped, and the views are measured within hours. Truth becomes something you can change. The story that makes people feel how you want them to feel gets shared. Users scrolling through their feeds encounter parts aligning with what they already believe. They see this confirmation as proof. Here, the saying that transparency is good becomes fragile. Social media is said to value real content. Influencers create vulnerability. Behind the scenes, they fix their lighting, choose the angle and time when to make emotional reveals. Studies on how people present themselves online profiles show that users create an identity to maximize support. Even being spontaneous is planned. I didn't expect how quickly viewers will accept a fake persona when the actions are consistent. Experiments on cognitive dissonance by Leon Festinger in the 1950s showed that people change their beliefs to match what they do when feeling uneasy. When followers agree with a figure, they start to protect that figure from others showing proof that goes against them. The story becomes self-protecting, and proving them wrong becomes hard. So, Why do people react more strongly to made-up stories than to the real world? Because dealing with the real world takes a lot of brain power. A story is effective. It makes a very big situation easier. It offers clarity, it gives good guys and bad guys, and it tells us where to stand. Machiavelli understood this centuries before formal cognitive psychology. He told leaders to seem good, even when acting strategically. This isn't because people are stupid, but because perception creates loyalty. Once they have an image, people view actions through that image. A harsh choice from a strong leader is shown as strength. The same choice from a corrupt opportunist is abuse. The action is the same. The perception changes the result. This can be felt when talking about people and power. A manager called visionary is given patience during failure, while a manager labeled incompetent is studied for small mistakes. Workers feel how feedback is received. Investors react to tone and earnings calls more than to the numbers. Juries are affected by how attorneys talk about a person before sharing proof. The disturbing result isn't that truth doesn't matter. It is that truth have to struggle in an unfair place. Perception dictates what facts are seen, forgotten, and forgiven. Once you notice that the battlefield shifts. Controlling the world without controlling people's perception ends up unstable, and trying to controlling perception without something real to back that up carries danger. At some point, image and structure collide. The surfacing question is darker. If perception can beat the reality, what happens when those who are good at convincing people stop caring about the aligning the former with the latter? If perception is key, then emotional investment is a supply line. The person who depends on the result more is already at a disadvantage. It all goes back to asymmetry of reactivity. Once you begin to see how narratives distort reality, the next level can be visible. Beneath image control lies influence, not loud dominance or charisma. Influence sits in the question neither side ask directly. Who needs this more? Attachment theory wasn't made to be a manual for power. John Bowlby and later Mary Ainsworth studied how infants connect with their caregivers in the 1960s and 70s. They found secure, anxious, and avoidant attachment styles. In a lab test like the strange situation, anxious children reacted strongly when separated, while avoidant children seemed not to care. For many years, avoidant behavior was mainly viewed as protective, but avoidant could be strategically power. I didn't expect that avoidant traits often match up with high control positions. Early 2000s research on leadership distance showed that executives described as less emotionally expressive were said by workers to be more direct during crisis. The workers were more stressed, but authority was clearer. The leader who doesn't look for reassurance forces others to follow them. Here, attachment theory becomes uneasy to discuss. In studies of negotiation, mainly by the program on negotiation at Harvard, one thing leads to success: the strength of one's BATNA, the best plan if the deal doesn't work out. The party that can walk away controls tempo. Emotionally separate is the psychological version of having a strong BATNA. If you can leave, whether internally or externally, you're harder to pressure. Behavioral economics shares another view. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky showed in the 1970s that we fear loss more than we prefer gain. Losing hurts more than winning feels good. In negotiation, the party that avoids loss more will give in faster. Emotional attachment makes the potential loss bigger. When a deal, relationship, or job becomes part of who you are, the cost of walking away becomes more. The detached party knows this, even if it isn't mentioned. I've watched this unfold in officer pay talk. One senior officer wanted to stay with a high-name company, asked strongly for praise and a plan. The board knew the title was his ultimate goal. Another candidate, with solid offers elsewhere, shared less emotionally. The board subtly changed direction. They favored the one who could leave. The one who cared more seemed committed. The one who cared less seemed stronger. The same situation occurs in even romantic ones, and it hurts. In 1998, Sandra Murray's work on dependence regulation theory showed that those who have greater investment in a relationship are greatly aware of rejection hints. They overthink delays, change of expression, and small rejections. Their mind becomes reactive. The partner who is less visibly affected sets the mood. This is rarely framed as power, but it is. The unease grows in high-stakes political. Stories from campaign workers show that who don't say they are panicked after negative polling stabilized team. Internally, they may be angry. Externally, they are measured. The team is stable because the leader stays grounded. Here, the idea of asymmetry becomes obvious. The more emotional party loses strength. This mechanism is seldom spoken about because it opposes what is thought of as good. We're told that caring about everything is good. It is in many cases, but caring about one thing is a negotiation, and that creates weakness. There's a reason top negotiators go, though, training for emotional detachment. Studies have measured the heat rate during negotiations and shows that those who had lower heat beat gave in less quickly. They delayed and paused, and the silence spreads. The opponent becomes worried and offers compromises to fill void. Silence is not emptiness. It means power is spread with wisdom. Machiavelli saw something like this in Prince's courts. He said a ruler who acted desperate with their longing for loyalty would be manipulated. A ruler who could give or take without expression could get obedience. It wasn't feelings that kept obedience. It controlled distance. This strategy has a cost. Lower-level workers who act for strong, distant leaders have less feelings of warmth. This causes stress, according to surveys on psychology. Partners of avoidant people describe feeling uncertain. The detached figure kept the power, but sacrificed feelings of warmth. I didn't expect to compromise so much. Detachment protected someone against, but also destroyed trust. And when power is fought over, those who can't be emotionally manipulated hold power. It all goes back to asymmetry of reactivity. We're not talking about numbness, as that is a problem. Strategic detachment comes from the idea of choosing the expression. Share enough about yourself to stay normal, but keep back enough to never be dependent on things. For a regular employee, it feels like you're constantly walking on eggshells. Feel like you care too much for someone or something. You become desperate for things like approval, promotion, or reassurance that will only weaken your place. And on the other hand, suppressing personal need for certain things is difficult. It reshapes the persona. Over time, the act of being nonchalant gets harder and even changes one's identity. It's a paradox since people who need less control more. But what happens if people don't need it all is what they truly want? What if not being in touch is no longer a strategy, but armor that be removed? In addition, if power grows from asymmetry of attachment, then the next level is must happen. If emotional distance gives power, what happens if someone deliberately designs it? If emotional distance gave leverage and impact, then lack of predictability magnifies it. Asymmetry is something that's created by distance. That asymmetry, in turn, creates a sense of dependency. One thing that we are taught is that consistency builds trust. In steady families, predictability is built for security. In organizations, there are clear expectations in order to reduce stress. This is one thing that we always know. Even then, if you analyze environments where influence is addictive, you will discover that there's a different reoccurring pattern being implemented. During 1950s, Burr's Frederick Skinner expressed that a behavior that's reinforced by variable schedule became resistant to removal. Specifically, pigeons continue pecking even without delivering food constantly. Casinos are constructed by this principle. Slot machines operate by variable ratio, as the uncertainty is the hook. The one truth that we realized is that the model transcends gambling for many aspects. During 2auth Centauri study using neurological scans shows there's dopamine spikes. The brain is reacting way intensely to the idea of reward than guarantee ones. The brain reacts intensely to maybe than yes. The uncertain raises the attention. It's something that is worth the same as currency, and I never thought how effective would be to relate the neuroactivity to leadership. In quite a few high-pressure work environments, former workers have noticed a common pattern. Recognition is infrequent and erratic. Guidance is inconsistent. Promotions happen without warning, and terminations are abrupt. Access to the leader's approval becomes a rare reward. Workers start watching for cues. They rethink meetings. They analyze small comments, looking for hidden meanings. How they perform isn't just about meeting goals. It's about responding to the emotional state of the person in charge. Officially, these environments are labeled as challenging or fast-paced. But unofficially, it feels like entering a place where the atmosphere shifts for no clear reason. You're never sure which version of the leader you'll encounter. This isn't accidental. Some leaders intentionally act unpredictably, so they don't become too easy to read. Awards that become expected lose their impact. Discipline that's predictable can be worked around. If both are unpredictable, then people pay close attention. A similar pattern shows up in relationship psychology. Studies that look at inconsistent reinforcement in romantic relationships show that people who experience hot-cold behaviors become more preoccupied than those in consistently warm or consistently distant relationships. Unpredictability keeps them emotionally invested. One day, there's intense closeness, and the next, withdrawal. The worried partner tries harder, not less. The uncertainty becomes what drives them. This idea challenges the thought that stability equals influence. Stability creates comfort. Uncertainty creates watchfulness. In behavioral models, unpredictability makes people check things more often. Think about how often people refresh their email or social media. Alerts don't come at set times. The varying timing keeps people involved. Tech companies in Silicon Valley have said they use behavioral studies. It's not just content that they are providing. It's anticipation. For average workers or partners, this can be tiring. Cortisol levels rise in regularly unpredictable environments. Workplace stress studies from the late 2000s found that unclear roles and inconsistent guidance were linked to higher burnout rates than heavy workloads alone. It's not just hard work that wears people down, it's instability. From the point of view of influence, instability focuses awareness on the source. Machiavelli warned that a leader should not be hated, but he didn't advise being completely predictable. A leader who changes alliances or makes sudden choices can stop competitors from working together. If others can't predict you, they hesitate. In game theory, acting unpredictably can be a smart move. Random patterns and competitions prevent being taken advantage of. The ethics get blurry when this goes from defending to being planned. I've seen leaders who wait before responding to build tension before talks. They'll ignore emails for days or put off meetings without saying why. The delay itself becomes a tool. This is not usually mentioned because it seems manipulative, and often it is. It gets results because people want to see patterns. When a pattern breaks, they pay more attention. Influence moves to the unpredictable source. There's a contradiction here. Chaos kills trust, and total stability lowers dependence. The right level of influence is in controlled unpredictability. There has to be enough difference to avoid comfort, but not enough to cause revolt. For those being led, it's a subtle but damaging feeling. You check messages more often. You practice conversations. You use mental energy to understand signals that don't exist. Over time, you focus on the person or system causing the uncertainty. That is when the rules become darker. It's not just about protecting your emotional state anymore. It's about shaping the minds of other people. The question is, what happens when fear is added to unpredictability, not loudly, but as a possibility in the back of your mind? When unpredictability gets your attention, fear adjusts obedience. It's not dramatic fear, not shouting or obvious threats, but a quiet knowledge that actions have consequences that can come without warning. Machiavelli said in The Prince that it is safer to be feared than loved. If you can't be both, people quote that a lot, but they usually miss the warning to not be hated. For him, fear had to be controlled, logical, and not personal. It could not be anger or pleasure-seeking cruelty, but controlled consequence. Today, companies don't allow leaders to be openly aggressive. Public embarrassment, obvious intimidation, and explosive anger can cause problems in a world of HR and social media. Obeying still happens. Keeping quiet still spreads. The system changed. In 2013, Amy Edmondson's work pointed out how teams do better when people can speak up without fear. The lack of that safety leads to silence, holding back information, and more risk. In company issues like Enron in the early 2000s or the Boeing disaster with the 737 MAX, investigations found silent internal environments where workers were afraid to question choices. Open threats were not always made, but disagreement could damage your reputation. Here, fear becomes a structure instead of just a show. Think about how people get fired at high-performing companies. Some investment banks and consulting firms have an annual review that's harsh. A percentage of the worst performers are let go. The reasons are not always clear. Leaders talk about merit, but workers know that one mistake can change everything. No one is shouting, but the knowledge that status can be taken away changes how people act. I've talked to workers who say that meetings feel like auditions. Guidance is filtered and questions are softened. The main emotion is watchfulness. You don't want to be the example. Status threat explains how this works. Studies have shown that social rejection activates the same brain areas as physical pain. When people feel that their status is threatened, their thinking becomes less flexible. They agree to group norms more easily. The fear is not of physical danger, but of being left out. Powerful people don't need to say these threats directly. Small signs work. A delayed answer to a message. A blank face during a presentation. A sudden removal from an invitation list. These are small signals, but they're amplified in hierarchies. The individual fills in the rest. I was surprised how little open aggression is needed to keep people in line. Open aggression often hurts in modern settings. It shows insecurity. Signaling gets the message across better. A leader who calmly says, "We'll reconsider your fit here," triggers more alarm than yelling. The uncertainty forces one to imagine the worst. In research on social dominance, individuals seen as high status tend to use fewer words, slower movements, and longer pauses. They interrupt less, but when they do, it's definite. These small actions show that the individual is not fighting for attention, but controlling it. Others change their posture, tone, and speaking speed. The change from actions to pressure becomes clear when fear is embedded in policy instead of personality. Performance metrics are tied to pay. Job assignments that can stall careers. Public ranking systems and teams. Even when described as transparency, these create concern. There are no explicit threats, but constant comparisons. For average workers, that can be confusing. You tell yourself you're respected, not scared. After all, no one is yelling. But you practice what you'll say before going into the leader's office. You measure your words. You check emails for tone, respect, and fear mix. Machiavelli's point was not that cruelty creates stability, but that controlled fear produces obedience without rebellion. If punishments are predictable and not personal, people will adjust. Hatred comes when fear feels random. Here lies the moral dilemma. A system can function with low-level fear. Deadlines are met, targets are reached, and disagreement is decreased. But innovation suffers when questioning feels dangerous. Unethical actions go unchallenged when silence seems safer than truth. I've seen teams defend leaders who clearly intimidate them, claiming they're just challenging. The lines between respect and fear get blurred when outcomes are rewarded. The system goes on as long as results prove the climate. But something shifts inside those who work under constant threat. Creativity narrows. Risk-taking goes down unless it's approved. The nervous system stays alert. We're now inside dominant systems. No raising voices or shouting. Just subtle reminders to where consequences lie. The contradiction grows sharper. If subtle fear brings obedience without rebellion, what stops it from getting stronger until no one remembers what it felt like to be truly respected? When subtle fear creates compliance, morality becomes their only layer of defense. Once results are expected, the only threat to power is rebellion. Ethical rebellion begins with a story about what's appropriate. Who decides that story? Findings are unsettling. When people were given the opportunity to affirm their own moral credentials, they later felt like they were more allowed to behave in ways that disagreed with said values. Prior virtue became credit. I was surprised how this spreads from people to organizations. Company value statements are standard. They include integrity and transparency. Yet investigations find differences between what is stated and what occurs. After the problems involving Volkswagen, documents pointed to pressure with messaging. The company had presented itself responsibly. That softened public reaction. People struggled to connect the brand with the violation. Morality is not only a guide, but it is a frame. Political strategists deeply grasp this principle. Reframing isn't just about using fancy speech. It's about crafting the usage of language to shape perception. During crucial shifts in policies that are contentious, the way we describe them changes. For example, instead of admitting deaths of non-combatants, a government might call it collateral damage. Changes to security become security enhancement. Increasing taxes can be called investments. The actual action itself might be the same. The way people feel about it might change. Some studies of political psychology in the early 2000s showed that slight word differences could sway public acceptance of the same ideas. When initiatives were presented as assistance for the poor, support varied greatly versus when they were labeled aid to people on welfare. The group benefiting was the same. The way it was morally presented shifted. Machiavelli was aware of this adaptability. He suggested managers act religious and virtuous, not because morality didn't matter, but because those ideas helped build trust. He wasn't promoting turmoil. Instead, he pushed for narrative control. If the leader defines what's necessary, difficult choices become duties, not moral lapses. Here's a crucial point. Controlling emotions and creating subtle apprehension reinforces position. Control over the moral explanation gives that person legitimacy. This idea affects workers daily. Imagine a company that says it values diversity but rewards only overwork and punishes anyone who speaks up. When a company does layoffs, they spin them as aligning with strategy for long-term goals. The language is sanitized. You feel something is wrong, but the official story makes sense. To remain accepted, you start changing how you see it. Perhaps it was needed. Maybe leaders know more. That mental conflict isn't a surrender. It seems like being reasonable. Past events can show this on a bigger scale. Leaders once criticized for consolidating power later become viewed as reformers if stability or success follows. Results change how we view previous choices. Doing well can justify previous ethical questions. Failure solidifies disapproval. Actions are judged differently based on their results. This provides opportunities to maneuver, influencing how results are seen or delaying judgment until results are in creates leeway. Some executives justify ethically questionable actions by saying they have a very long-term vision. They might say that short-term sacrifices are needed for long-term survival. Criticism fades when quarterly numbers rise. When they don't, the same choice is seen as careless. The outcome becomes proof of moral standing. Here's where the idea becomes clear. Morality in power systems is often fluid. It's negotiated with explanations, strengthened by shared identity, and upheld through mutual gain. Those who dictate what's seen as a need control what others will accept. This doesn't mean ethics aren't real. It means they're shaped socially. And in hierarchies, that influence moves top-down. This creates unease because flexible morals give managers a layer of protection. By recasting actions as needed, strategic, or justifiable within a new story, outside disapproval loses impact. Critics are seen as ignorant or short-sighted. The leader isn't defending behavior, but defending a higher cause. Resistance becomes difficult for those underneath. Speaking out means questioning the entire moral system, which risks one's reputation. You're not just disagreeing, but seen as disloyal or unrealistic. Morality rarely collapses suddenly. Instead, it bends slowly. Language changes. Standards shift. What once seemed unthinkable becomes practical. This brings up an important question. If power can change perceptions, feelings, and even the definition of right and wrong, then what remains untouched by it? Furthermore, if morality can be reframed and subtle fear can be quietly built into structure, the last safe place is simple. Control who has access. This isn't just about your schedule. It's about your inner thoughts. Access provides leverage. In 1984, Robert Cialdini outlined that people value things more when they seem rare. His tests showed that the perception of cookies in a nearly empty jar were more desirable. even when they were identical to cookies in a full jar. The cookies stayed the same, but the idea of availability made them more attractive. Now, apply this idea from cookies to one's character. Leaders who share too much risk exposing themselves. Subordinates start predicting moods. Colleagues identify vulnerabilities. Opponents track weaknesses. What was shared becomes a map of knowledge. I used to think being honest always built trust. It can, but studies on leadership show that those seen as leaders controlled their feelings, spoke concisely, and shared selectively. They didn't have to be especially warm, but they were in control. People saw them as centered, even without much personal sharing. Here, it's less important for leaders to be liked. Instead, by being less predictable, the leader forces others to work harder to understand them, creating an illusion of depth. Communication patterns associated with high status also strengthen that illusion. Studies of judges, top officers, and managers share recurring traits: measured speech, silence, minimal filler, and limited honesty. They don't talk about their feelings, but instead make decisions from up high. Again, silence shifts focus. Those below feel uneasy. Employees often call leaders hard to read. That term often correlates with both intimidation and respect. When leaders overshare personal info, the company feels less formal. When a leader listens without showing their response, hierarchy is clear. It comes down to who knows what. In negotiations, revealing too much weakens one's position. Studies show that parties who admit deadlines give in quicker. The side that keeps its plans hidden retains room to maneuver. Social media creates a more complex situation because those platforms reward honesty. But popular figures still curate their image. It's a performance of honesty. The heart is never seen. Those in leadership positions who disclose too much often come across as insecure. Authority decreases when the leader becomes relatable or manageable. Restraint creates space for others to imagine that person. When you share less, others fill the gaps, often inflating strengths or resolve. It's not magic, but creates perception. Centuries ago, Machiavelli said to hide one's true feelings. Strategic ambiguity stops rivals from working together and manipulating preferences. For employees, that dynamic is clear. They know expectations well and have made adjustments. But employees only seize pieces of their manager's thought processes. It's similar in relationships. The partner who shares only what they choose retains influence. There's a cost. Too much secrecy can breed mistrust. Without context, teams invent stories, usually negative. But moderate secrecy makes others respect the leader. Psychological untouchability includes controlling emotion, creating uncertainty, and reshaping morals. Limiting access limits leverage. However, when protection becomes isolation, no one can influence that person. Therefore, controlling perception is fragile. In 1962, Richard Emerson said power lies in controlling what others need, and reliance means vulnerability. Independence determines vulnerability. The less dependent has more power, not due to traits, but due to options. Optionality lets one negotiate differently. Behavioral economics shows having other options changes risk. For example, throughout the 1980s, participants who had strong alternatives rejected unfair offers more often than those who didn't. Choosing to avoid total loss, those participants accepted less favorable terms. Psychology shows individuals with minimal savings had higher stress and obeyed more in disputes. If your living relies on only one source, your decisions change. When leaders possess wealth, income, or stature beyond the company, they will speak differently. They take their time, show more dissent, and are harder to threaten due to not being tied to one choice. For example, when Steve Jobs returned to Apple, he also founded Next and contributed to Pixar. His identity was separated from a board's approval. Compared to other founders who rely on investor relationships, his negotiation dynamic differed. Labor markets show employees with the skills demanded by numerous firms command higher wages. Performance reviews feel like conversations when you possess savings, connections, and plans. When you have debts and no backup, reviews feel like judgment. Limited options reshape cognition. In the early 2000s, research showed that short-term restrictions impairs planning, that psychological dominance is not due to discipline, but the idea of other alternatives. Independence backs all listed choices, and without that authority, each listed decision risks collapsing because it seems like a bluff. A manager solely dependent on mercenaries faces instability, and Emerson argues, loyalty purchased temporarily could evaporate. Those ideals endure when it's already implemented. This is especially illustrated in corporate governance, as this structural idea keeps them safe from short-term pressure. Psychological dominance is ultimately reliance on authority and independence. Independence is distributed unevenly. Systems are not fair. Some are closer to authority than others. If you can be easily replaced, the more cautious you become, and the less you need, the more freely you move. So, if untouchability is the power to leave, then what happens to people in systems that restrict that feeling? Everyone examined here simply reinforces each other. Perception control builds emotion. Detachment reinforces the interior. Also, uncertainty destabilizes you. Subtle fear regulates behaviors. Moral narrative control legitimizes decisions. Strategic opacity restricts access, and independence locks you. Those are not actions, but habits together reduce outreach and approachability. Imagine those with emotional reactivity repeatedly adjust judgments, and it can threaten one's social standing. The reactive is readable. Exclusion damages them, and their internal states are observable. However, imagine that versus being strategic, as those rated show minimal expressions. Those around may call them calm, hard to read, etc. This is not their traits, but permeably. The more emotional access you provide, the more you are retaining influence and maintaining that influence. Control perception ensures external narratives never define you. Emotion is regulated to not threaten your behavior. Subtle fear enables compliance without being mean. Moral reframing lets actions be justified to preserve legitimacy. Scarcity provides less access, but gains value and makes the configuration credible. Psychological untouchability is not emotional strength, but less emotional exposure. Human with untouchability cause responsive triggers. In corporate, untouchableness is valued decisive and strong. Though admiration seems viable, that comes at the relation cost of the untouchable feeling. Middle managers reduce honesty, limit talking, and cultivate neutrality, and the team members stop volunteering doubt. That lowers innovation, but increases compliance. Power follows morality and affection. Institutional survival relies on safety. The optimized model does not fully guarantee loyalty. Each entry point is guarded by fewer triggers that destabilize you. Power begins where emotional access ends. Insulation separates. Being unreachable limits closeness and interaction, and being moved and touched by another makes it harder to connect with them and the ones around you. What does untouchability cost? That can be reframed to increase success, but comes at the cost of willingly be open to influence. When building and using these systems, are you seeking protection from manipulation or for dominance? The system does not simply stand.